In our lesson this evening, we're going to be looking at section 23 out of the fourfold gospel, which talks about Jesus' first residence at Capernaum. And if you're following along, we're going to be looking specifically and starting there in John, the 2nd chapter, and verse 12. As we were studying in our last lesson, we were looking at we've seen some of the first disciples that Jesus had who began to follow him. In the last week we were talking about some of the first miracle, especially that he did in Cana of Galilee. And this week we're going to be talking about the first residence that he had at Capernaum. Now, generally speaking, we refer to him as Jesus of Nazareth because that's where he grew up and that's where his residence is. And generally speaking, he came up there in that city. But as we look into his earthly ministry, we see that there have been some changes along the way. And so he seems to be spending more time in the city of Capernaum. That's the city that we were looking at and he was at when he and John and others, especially when he picked up Peter and Andrew and some of those, probably James and John along the way also. And so if you're looking at a map around the Sea of Galilee, Nazareth is off to the west, and it's not one of the cities that sits right on the Sea of Galilee. Nazareth is over to the west. It's probably, and I'm just going to guess, but it's about halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean Sea, so it's further inland. However, Capernaum, if you're looking at a map, is at the northern shore, almost in the middle of the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. And so in the process of time, he has moved his residence from Nazareth to Capernaum. At least that's where seems his mother and brethren and them are at this time. And between Capernaum and Nazareth is a city of Cana, of which he apparently had some family member or close friend that we were talking about last week in the wedding. And so they came from Capernaum and they came up to Cana for the wedding that was there. And once the wedding was over, in verse 12, it says, after this, he went down to Capernaum. Now, generally speaking, in the Bible, when we're talking about up or down, we're not necessarily talking about north or south. We're talking about in elevation. And so Capernaum, as it says, is at a lower elevation. And at the time of this writing, I'm not sure of today, I didn't check it, but at the time of this writing, Capernaum was about 600 feet below sea level. And so that part of the Holy Land around the Sea of Galilee, it's kind of a bowl. Everything drains into that. That's why there's a sea in the middle of everything there in the land. And so he went back there to that city. And if we notice, there are kind of four groups or individuals, however you want to look at it. But it says he went down to Capernaum, and it goes on, it says he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples. And so because it breaks it down in that, there's a discussion in here, and we'll kind of look at that in a minute about the use of the term brethren. But in this specific part of the passage, when it's talking about his brethren, we understand that his family had went up. Mary and Jesus and the family and his disciples were invited to go up to the wedding, which was there in Cana of Galilee. And so the disciples, since they were from Capernaum, and his family apparently is living in Capernaum, and therefore they all returned back to the city of Capernaum. And so there is a discussion as to sometimes what it means when it's talking about his brethren, but it's clear in this particular passage here that it's talking about his actual family. We know that Jesus had brothers, and we know that he had sisters, and so if the family was invited to a wedding, they would have all been there, or the ones at least who could have. And so the term brethren here is not necessarily talking about church brethren or religious brethren, but it's talking about his family. And of course his disciples that he acquired, that we looked at previously, as John the Baptist introduced a couple of his disciples to Jesus. They in turn found family members and introduced them to Jesus, and he began to acquire his disciples. Now there is a discussion down in here about the brothers and the family and the brethren, in the sense that it has been the teachings of the Catholic Church that Mary was a perpetual virgin. That is, that after the birth of Jesus, she did not have any other children. And of course, we know that the scriptures tell us that Joseph did not know her until after Jesus was born, and know there's in the true biblical sense. And so the fact that she was some perpetual virgin is not upheld by the scriptures. And some of the Catholic teachings, when people say, well, wait a minute, it talks about his brethren, how can he have brethren if she didn't have any more children? And of course, in Catholicism, there is a doctrine that teaches that Joseph had children before he married Mary, that he was married before. And again, the doctrine fluctuates, but for the sake of the argument, we're going to say that wife died, left him with children. He married Mary, and so the brethren of Jesus were not literally his full brothers and sisters, but they were stepbrothers and sisters. But since, again, as we've talked about, since Joseph adopted Jesus and all of that, their ideas that they became his brethren because Jesus was adopted by Joseph. And so that's how they tie their doctrine into neat little bits and pieces. But we can spend a lot of time, and I don't really want to spend a lot of time going over what it's talking about specifically in arguing back and forth with the Catholic Church. Jesus accepted them as such, and they were with Mary, even though Joseph was not there. Of course, again, they can make all kinds of arguments. Some of those that we see in some of the references here, the fact that they were traveling with Jesus, doesn't mean that they were necessarily his disciples at that time. And some people bring up the fact that his brethren didn't and weren't necessarily believing in him. And we have some of those verses down here where there is some discussion about that. John 7, 3, 5, in that especially talks about when Jesus was, they were prodding him to go up to the feast to Jerusalem, And it makes a notation there that his brethren, that would be his brothers and sisters and family, had not quite yet accepted the fact that he was the Messiah. And so they, they were trying to get him to commit to something, and they were still apparently somewhat doubtful. But
Matthew 12 and 49, it says, he stretched forth his hand toward his disciples and said, Behold, my mother and my brother. Was his disciples. He was referring to his.
Well, he was basically saying that those who would do his will, those who were his disciples, were the same as his mother and his brethren. I mean, just like here tonight, we're all brothers and sisters in Christ, and Christ is our elder brother. But there in Matthew 12, or in Matthew 13:55, if somebody wants to turn and read that, I don't, but in Matthew 13 and 55, there is a scripture there that talks about his brethren and those who are related to him.
It says, "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brethren James and Joseph and Simon and Judas?"
Yeah. And so, we clearly see in that verse that he had at least 4 brothers in that discussion, that the people were, even the people were aware of these individuals that were in his family. And so we have James, and James is one of those who was an elder in the church there at Jerusalem. This is not James, the brother of John, but this is James, the half-brother of Jesus. And so it is the James that wrote the epistle that we know as James. And then it refers to Judas, and that's not the Judas who betrayed him, but that is the one who is in the New Testament referred to as Jude. And so he is the one who wrote the letter of Jude. Now, in the original Greek, it has Judas in the book of Jude. Yes?
If these were Jesus' brothers, how would they have been? Jesus was what? He was 30 when he started his ministry.
He would have been 30 when he started his ministry, and then again after Mary and Joseph came back. We don't know how many children and how fast Joseph and Mary had children, but it's been 30 years since Jesus was born, and so in 30 years you can have quite a few kids. I know my grandparents did a pretty good job of it. So
Even mentioned sisters too.
yeah, and as we go through here, if we go over to Mark 6 and 3, I think if we'll look at that one. Mark 6 and 3, it talks about James and Joses and Judah and Simon are not his sisters here with us. And so we have listed in Mark's account, along with the others, we have 4 brothers, and in order to have sisters, you got to have at least 2. So besides Jesus, Joseph and Mary would have had 6 other children at least. And so that's, again, not necessarily an unheard of thing in a process. We don't know how long Joseph was alive and what exactly happened to him, and he just kind of drops out between age 12 and at age 30. But we need to understand sometimes the scriptures don't give us everything, and so when Jesus was 12 years old and he went up to the temple, we don't know how many more children that Joseph and Mary was taking along with them on that journey when he was 12. And that might very well explain the fact that since he was the oldest son and he was 12 years old, they didn't think they needed to keep quite as close an eye on him as they needed to keep on his four brothers and his sisters and the rest of the family. And so, but we do have that. And so, you have to determine for yourself whether or not these are his literal brethren. I know that there's got to be an argument, but on the other side, or the flip side of that, is that by this time, if these were Joseph's children and they were older than Jesus, again, Jesus would be the youngest one of the whole bunch. He was 30 years old. And if Joseph had children before that, these people are in their 30s. And so they would have been long gone kind of on their own, doing their own thing. But these individuals are still with Mary. They're still associating with Mary and his brethren. They're all there together. Jesus is at Capernaum. Mary's at Capernaum. His brethren are there at Capernaum, which would be the four that we've looked at here, plus at least two sisters, and we don't know. So when you look at this little band, again, when we think about, Mary going, Jesus and his disciples, but when you start thinking about, what kind of setup that you could have had here, if Jesus is 30, he had at least two sisters that were already married and having children and brothers and all that were younger than him that may or may not have been married. But you've got all of that, and then you've got cousins and all of those that are going to the wedding. And so there was a nice little caravan of individuals that were traveling. His sisters and his brethren and his mother and the disciples that he was acquiring. Peter and Andrew were fishermen there along the Sea of Galilee, and they were also partners. The families were partners, it seems, also with James and John. And so we have James and John and Peter and Andrew and those who were associated together. And in some of the other Gospels, it seems that they're there when Jesus was calling Peter and them. He also was calling James and John and others along with that. Me personally, again, it really doesn't matter. Not really in the greater scheme of things. If these were Joseph's children, and when he married Mary, and if their mother was deceased, it's pretty much the same thing. And that is that if these were Joseph's children, they would have been adopted by Mary, and they would have been considered the children of Mary in that family, just as much as when Joseph named Jesus when he was circumcised and at the temple. He, in essence, was, while the world may not have always recognized that, we've already talked about that, but again, he was adopting Jesus and he was being grafted into his family tree. And again, in the Old Testament, we see things all the time about if a man dies leaving no descendants or children, that his brother would marry his wife and they would have a child, and that child would be again considered to be the child of his brother, and he would take the inheritance of his brother and would be subject to the inheritance of his brother. And so, there's a lot of those kind of things that ultimately, and when you look at it from a Jewish standpoint, it really don't matter. The only thing is that the only reason any of it would matter in the argument is the concept of the Perpetual Virgin Mary. And so the Catholic Church still prays to and still refers to her as the Virgin Mary. And, this, again, we could, like I said, we could spend a lot of time going into that, but from the scriptural standpoint, we just, I don't see where, that really holds a lot of, it's important for her to, they have exalted her to really even above sainthood. They refer to her as Mary, the Mother of God, and they refer to all kinds of strange terms and names. And Mary was the mother of Jesus, and Jesus was in the beginning God, but that really doesn't make her the mother of God. I mean, she didn't give birth. He wasn't, again, she didn't create him in that sense. So we have to be careful about how we use that and how people, again, use that term. And this is another issue when I was doing some study with the Muslims. They believe that the Trinity, their concept again of the Trinity, they believe based on some misunderstandings of Catholic doctrine that they were introduced to by some of the early church. Remember, they were Muhammad and them, and Islam was established around 600 AD. And this is a time that the Catholic Church was taking root. About 600 AD is when a lot of formalization of the true Roman Catholic Church and the Pope and all that was coming into play. But again, the Muslims teach that the Catholics believe in the Trinity, and the Trinity is God the Father, God the Son, and Mary, the Mother of God. And so this is another reason why they have issue with the concept of the Trinity, that Mary was the Mother of God and she's part of the Trinity and all this. And again, if we tried to touch upon all the doctrines that exist in the world, we could spend a long time about dealing with false doctrines. But we have to ask ourselves, what did John mean when John said what he said, and what was the Holy Spirit trying to get us to understand when he said that? And, he, again, made it clear that Jesus, his mother, his brethren, and his disciples went down, and so neither John nor any other that I'm aware of, the New Testament writers, make any issue with the fact that these 4 men and at least the 2 women were his mother and brothers and sisters. Again, Jesus, he doesn't deny that. And again, there's issue as to why when Jesus was on the cross that he gave the care of his mother to John rather than to some other family members. And, the only thing I can say is because that's what he did. That's back to theory again. The Bible doesn't say why when John was there. My guess is that John was a very close disciple and he knew how long John was going to live. And so, again, you don't want to pick James or somebody else to take care of her when they're going to be gone in a few years, but he knew that as long as Mary lived, John would still be alive, and therefore, with Peter and the rest of them who would be persecuted and killed and all along the way. And some of Jesus' brothers were, as we said, instrumental and important in the church. James was an elder in the church apparently at Jerusalem. Jude, the brother of Jesus, was also active in the ministry and in that. So there's probably many different reasons, but thinking from my perspective, if I wanted somebody to take care of my mama and I knew what the future was of everybody there, I think I'd go for the long haul. I don't know how long Mary may have necessarily lived. But again, John was one who he believed was able to take care of his mom. Does anybody have any insights or questions or discussions about this? Jesus is going back to Capernaum after they have been to the wedding. But the interesting thing is as we continue in this verse, it says, and there they abode not many days. And by that it means that by the time they got there, they were there a few days, and they left again. This is, as a writer says, again, a brief notice of the sojourn of Jesus to Capernaum. It lists 4 items here. We'll just touch on a bit. It shows where Jesus spent most of his time between his baptism and the first Passover was in Capernaum. He didn't change his name. People didn't refer to him as Jesus of Capernaum. He grew up in Nazareth, and that's where he was from, and that was, more or less his hometown. And so that's, again, but when we're trying to figure out what Jesus was doing from his baptism to the time that he went up to Jerusalem to the first Passover, that's one of the things that we clearly see here in these verses. It helps to explain later on while the nobleman who was there around Capernaum in the scriptures, we see the nobleman sends looking for Jesus, and he was acquainted to him perhaps because he had met him or knew of him when he was there at Cana at the marriage feast. Again, it causes us to look, for his first visit back to Nazareth, which will be part of his journey, and tells us why he spent a lot of time in Capernaum. If he's Jesus of Nazareth, why he spent a lot of time in Capernaum? Because there was a house there. Peter had a house there. James and John had a house there. Many of his disciples had homes there. And just as a point, there has been found in some of the excavation and archaeology that's going on and goes on in the Holy Land around the area of Capernaum. They found an old synagogue that was, again, had been buried over the years, but there was an inscription on the synagogue. There was a plaque or a dedication plaque that the synagogue was dedicated by the grandsons of Simon Peter. And so it looks as if they, of course, at that time, synagogue would have been the place of worship. Didn't really think of it as a church building per se, but it's just kind of an interesting thing that that notation has been found. Now, whether that's the same Simon Peter or whether that's the same family, who knows, but it is an interesting tidbit that they find there in the Passover. So there's a lot of stuff here in this one verse in John 2 and 12. Any questions, comments? Y'all being quiet tonight. We're going to go into part 4 for just a little while this evening by kind of way of an introduction. As we come into part 4, since we're talking about first, this is the first, we're going to go into the first Passover of Jesus after he started his earthly ministry. And in this particular section, we're going to be going from the first Passover that he had after his baptism. This isn't his first Passover. He's 30 years old. He's been around a lot of Passovers, but this is his first Passover after his earthly ministry. And this section, as it's divided up here, goes all the way to the second Passover, which, as we see in the parentheses here, means that we're looking at the first year of the life of Jesus in his earthly ministry as it takes on a more formal part. Up to this point, we've kind of seen the whole process is kind of ramping up. We saw about John the Baptist and his preaching and preparing the way, and John pointing Jesus out to his disciples, and some of the disciples of John, as well as new disciples, are beginning to follow Jesus, and various things are going on. People are beginning to take note of what some of the events that's going on. And so as we leave verse 12 and come into verse 13 through 25, still of John 2, after they were there not many days, we're told that the Passover of the Jews was at hand. And so the Passover of the Jews would have been on the 10th day of the first month on the Jewish calendar. And so this wedding that we're talking about took place somewhere close to the beginning of the Jewish New Year. Whether it happened at the end of the previous year or toward the first, but we see that he was not at Capernaum for very long before we run up on the Passover. And so we get a little bit of information here, and Brother McGarvey lets us know from this, talking about some of the things that helps us understand. We talk about the ministry of Jesus being about 3 or 3.5 years. Well, we have the portion of whatever time going backwards that Jesus was in his beginning his public ministry, and the 40 days that he was in the wilderness, and back to the baptism of John. So we go to the baptism of John. We have 40 days, a little over a month in the wilderness, and then we see some of the things that are going on here. So that's part of that portion that we think of as the half, or that part of a year. We get that information. And so one of the main things that happens through here is this is the first Passover, which is at hand. There will be a second, and then there will be a third Passover, and part of the dedication, and then we loop around to Passover again, which this Passover to the second Passover is 1 year, the second to the third is 2, the third to the fourth is 3, and at the third or the fourth Passover, it's there when he's at the fourth Passover in Jerusalem that he is betrayed and crucified. So we can count by using this, we can count through those years to see that his ministry was about 3 to 3.5 years. That's how we get those kind of dates. And so the Jewish Passover was at hand. There's an obligation there, as we've talked about, that all the Jewish men should appear before God in Jerusalem, offering sacrifices. This was mandatory for the men. It was optional for the women. We've talked about this as a kind of a big family reunion, and so a lot of people would go up to Jerusalem. Even though it was optional for the women, they would still go because they get to see people that they haven't seen maybe for a year. And so this is the big one, taking and eating the Passover meal with the family. And I don't really want to make it sound like it's Thanksgiving, but if you kind of think about it, one of the biggest times that people get together to just enjoy one another, and the day is Thanksgiving. Christmas, it's all about the build up to it, but the day it's once it comes, it's over, and but Thanksgiving is a big family thing about getting the people around the table, and so that's kind of what the Passover was like. And again, it's not the same thing, but it's an important thing. Most of us can remember growing up that you were at grandma's house, the whole family came into grandma's house or somewhere thereabouts for Thanksgiving. It was one of those times that even those who had traveled, in our family to Ohio and Michigan and different places, they would make it back home for, or to some of their families for that. And so the Passover is an important thing. And so Jesus went up to Jerusalem from Capernaum. And of course, we're talking about in elevation. Again, not talking about north or south, but Capernaum, as we said, is about 600 feet below sea level, and Jerusalem is on one of the higher mountains in that area. And so they were coming up out of Capernaum and the area around the Sea of Galilee toward the city there of Jerusalem, where the Passover would take place. And of course, when he comes into the city, we're told that he finds in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money. And of course, this becomes an issue with him. The outer court, which many times we think of as the court of the Gentiles, was a place where this merchandising and money changing and all that was taking place. It wasn't in the temple proper. It was in the court of the Gentiles, which was the outermost court. You still had to go up some steps and barrier to get into the court of the women, the court of Israel. And so they were still in the area where the Gentiles were, but they were set up where they could sell these animals and things.
He threw a temper tantrum, didn't he?
He was upset. He was upset. It's interesting. I'm sure for the preceding years that he's been there, he's seen this. I don't think this was the first time that they were doing this. However, we have to understand that was when he was, again, in his obscure, growing, preparing point. But now he's not just a visitor to the temple, but he has now formally and officially entered into his public ministry. And so if you want to think about it this way, he hit the ground running. It's something that he has probably seen for many years and has known about probably since even before he came in the flesh. When he was God in heaven, he probably saw what was going on. But he comes into the temple now as Jesus in his official capacity as the Messiah, the Christ. And we're told that he made a scourge of cords. And then in the midst of all of that, we're told that he started the process of driving or casting them out of the temple, both the sheep and the oxen, and he poured over the money changers' tables. And then those who sold doves, he told them to take those things away or from hence. Now, something that he points out here, and it's kind of an interesting thing. We generally think that at this point he took the scourge and used it on who? Most of the time people think it's the money changers and those who were selling the animals that he was beating with the scourge that he made. But that's not what this says. It says that he drove out of the temple both the sheep and the oxen. And so he's not thrashing the people. He is thrashing the animals. And of course, you give an animal a good strong whop on its hind side, horse or whatever, and that pretty much gets it moving. And so he kind of caused a little bit of a what I'd say stampede, getting the animals riled up and trying to get them out. But it doesn't say that he actually hit the people. It says that he drove them out And then when it explains who them were, or they out, it's both the sheep and the oxen, not the people. But what he did do for the people is he turned the tables over that belonged to the money changers. Now you got to think about this, because these, you kind of have a picture in here, but these money changers, you know, they've got all these coins and all this, and they're counting, and they've got everything kind of organized so that as people come there, what these exchange was for is they were trading Roman coins that had the image of Caesar, which again to the Jews was kind of an abomination to bring any graven image into the temple. And so they would bring these coins that had the image of Caesar or somebody else on them, and they would trade them with these money changers for more acceptable money from the area there of Judea, which may have had wheat or some other thing on there, but didn't, palm trees and different things, but no animals, no graven images per se. They've got all this stuff set up, and you know, money changers, bankers, whatever, they like to know to the last cent what they've got. You know, they want to know that we came out today with, you know, $300 worth of Judean coins, and we exchanged that for these coins. And of course, at the end of the day, they're going to want on the exchange rate to see how much money they've acquired. So you have these different people there, and again, they may vie for business. You know, I'll give you this for that, and somebody else says, but I'll give you this for that, and again, free enterprise. Well, can you imagine the hearts of these money changers when Jesus flipped their tables upside down? What happened?
He let the people know the temple wasn't the place for that.
All of the money is rolling all over the floor, and nobody knows whose money belongs to who now. I mean, he's flipped the tables over. And I mean, I kind of have an idea, because when I first worked for the post, to come to work at the post office, of course, we all had our cash drawer that we used on the window, and I set the door of the safe was halfway open, and I set my drawer on top of that, and I had it balanced on the top of the safe and on the top of the door. And I turned around to get something else, and of course I wasn't that familiar with the whole process, but when I put weight on the door was heavy enough that it started closing on its own. And so with my back turned, I heard the whole drawer with all the pennies, nickels, dimes, quarters, anything hit the floor, and it was like an explosion. I mean, some of you have been to the post office in Hamlin, and I mean, literally there was money everywhere, under everything, and I'm down on my hands and knees crawling around trying to find, you know, everything, because I have to pay for anything that's missing. And so if I can't find the quarter, I've got to put the quarter in there and we count it. So I can just imagine the way the money changers felt if there were 6, 8, 10, 12, and I'm sure there's probably more than that, because a lot of people come into the temple on that day. And he's just going through there flipping these tables over, and money is going everywhere. And can you imagine the confusion it was? Because you got all these people saying, well, that was mine, that one's mine, that one's mine, these are mine. And people arguing over how you divide all that stuff back up.
There was probably licks in too.
Do what?
Probably some licks in.
Yeah, I'm sure there was a lot of people, but it's kind of interesting to me, you know, as we look at that, and Jesus coming in there and driving the animals out, turning over the money changers. And of course, the doves, one of the things it says here is that those who sold doves, he told them to basically take them out. They would have been in some kind of wicker type cage probably, and so they were closed up. And so rather than standing there and trying to rip open every one of the cages that had the doves to release them, he told them to get them out of there. Make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And so,
You wouldn't know how much coins was traded for the other coins, would you,
Yeah.
when they're all together?
so I mean, it's everything's together, and so they don't have a whole lot of insight into, what's going on. Time's up for this evening, and Lord willing, we'll hopefully be able to come back next week and look at that. But if you're looking at Jesus, the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry in a formal way and coming in with a bang, you can't really expect a lot more than that. If you want attention, you've got there's this crazy guy down there who's turned over all the money changers' tables, and that crazy guy's driven the animals out of the temple and caused a stampede and got people running everywhere, and there's money turned upside down and people are crawling around scooping it up. The other thing you got to remember is he turned those tables over. You suppose only the money changers were interested in picking up them coins?
Everybody was different down.
Yeah, I can imagine, there may be one or two people saying, would you like me to help you pick that up? But I imagine most of them, just like today, is, they've been ripped off enough. And so if they could scrape a pocket full of coins and take off, there were some there that I'm sure, again, not trying to say they're dishonest, but free money's free money. And so when you can't tell it's yours, and so you can't tell it ain't mine, so we're just going to take it. All right, thank you for your attention and comments. Lord willing, we'll pick up there next Wednesday evening.
Why not make this the day that you and your family seek out the Church of Christ in your community? We encourage you to attend one of our worship times or Bible studies. God's grace, truth, and salvation is truly worth finding and knowing. May God bless and keep you as we walk together in His truth. And remember, as always, the Churches of Christ salute you. Our new programs are posted to Facebook and YouTube on Thursday afternoon, and they should be available for viewing by 7 p.m. We also encourage our viewers to visit our website at www.thechurchesofchrist.life. We ask that you like us on Facebook and share our programs. On YouTube, please share and subscribe for notifications. This program was pre-recorded.